Hey everyone, just a reminder that I am going to be participating in this year's Intelligent Speech Conference on November 4th, 2023. It's an online conference where you get to interact with all your favorite history podcasters. I'm giving a keynote address and I'm participating in a roundtable with the wonderful Daniele Bolelli of History on Fire. If you want tickets, then please go to intelligentspeechonline.com and use coupon code FAKE when you check out to get a discount. See you on November 4th. It was a regular Tuesday afternoon in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, in May of 2004. When a man boarded the number 98 TransLink bus. The man was middle-aged, had dark hair, a thin mustache, and a noticeable 5 o'clock shadow. Witnesses remembered that he looked like he might be Middle Eastern. When the bus made its scheduled stop at 49th Street and Granville Avenue, the man got up, headed to the front of the bus, and stepped off. But before he did, he turned to the bus driver and asked, "Hey, how's your day going?" The bus driver said, "Good." Then the man nodded his head and cryptically said, "Well, it won't be for long," before exiting the bus and calmly walking off into the Vancouver afternoon. The bus driver closed the doors and kept on with his route. But soon he felt extremely nauseous. By the time the driver had driven just 10 kilometers from where he had dropped off the mysterious passenger, he was so overcome by the sick feeling that he vomited. Obviously distressed, the driver turned to the remaining passengers and asked if any of them were feeling nauseous as well. One passenger said, yes, actually, they were feeling a little off. With that, the driver found a safe spot to pull over roadside and immediately called the paramedics. The driver feared that his bus may have been the target of a chemical or biological terrorist attack. The paramedics arrived on the scene, listened to the driver's description of what happened, and started treating him. But soon, they too were feeling nauseous and vomiting. Soon there were a number of police officers and other first responders on the scene, and sure enough, many of them also started feeling ill. A total of 19 bus passengers and first responders were briefly quarantined to hopefully stop the spread of whatever this mystery illness was. Perhaps this truly had been a biological attack. The so-called toxic bus incident made headlines in Canada and was reported on globally. It also triggered a major investigation into what many believed had been an act of terrorism. Extensive tests were run on materials taken from the bus and the air filter of the vehicle. In addition, wide-ranging medical tests were performed on all of those affected by the so-called toxic bus. After they were complete, Vancouver's chief medical health officer, Dr. John Blatherwick, returned with some very surprising conclusions. The tests had shown no evidence of anything unusual in the air, the upholstery, or any other part of the bus. Beyond their initial nausea and vomiting, the affected people showed no other signs that they had been poisoned or infected with a disease. This was a normal bus, and the alleged victims were basically healthy. Dr. Blatherwick's conclusion was that this had not been an act of terrorism. This was, in fact, a textbook example of a mass psychogenic illness, also known as mass hysteria. This diagnosis was supported by a University of British Columbia epidemiologist, Dr. Richard Mathias, who at the time told the CBC, quote, "Nausea, vomiting, all of those kinds of things are associated with this psychological phenomenon. Somebody starts to get sick, and then it rapidly spreads to other people. It's quite a classic presentation for this sort of thing." End quote. The experts would go on to explain that the people who got sick were not faking their symptoms. They truly felt sick. But these symptoms were brought on by a strange quirk of human psychology and not any toxins released in the environment. This explanation was unacceptable to the Vancouver Police Department, who rejected the idea that seasoned police officers and 2 experienced paramedics could have possibly been sucked in to a wave of mass hysteria. One of the lead police investigators would tell the media, quote, "You're talking about 2 very senior ambulance attendants, and they're not going to have psychosomatic symptoms. They've seen everything." End quote. The ambulance paramedics of British Columbia were similarly offended at the suggestion that this illness had been in the heads of 2 unimpeachable first responders. A spokesperson for the paramedics defended the medics on the scene as, quote, "2 paramedics that have close to 50 years of combined experience, the majority of that experience in one of the busiest ambulance stations in Canada." End quote. He also added, quote, "I know these paramedics personally, and they exemplify compassion, commitment, competence, caring, and professionalism." End quote. The Vancouver police went so far as to set aside the tests that had been conducted by the RCMP. That's the Mounties, our federal police force, for all you non-Canadians out there. The Vancouver police hired an outside firm to conduct new tests on the bus's air filter. Sure enough, these new tests revealed that there may have been a suspicious chemical on the bus, something called methyl chloride, which, when inhaled in large quantities, can indeed cause some of the symptoms experienced by the bus driver and the first responders. With these new test results in hand, the police insisted that this event needed to be treated as an act of terror, and doctors needed to stop suggesting that police officers were part of a mass panic. But this claim was suspicious and was soon challenged by a number of experts familiar with the investigation. Methyl chloride is a naturally occurring chemical and is especially common near the ocean. Vancouver is Canada's largest Pacific port. For this chemical to have toxic effects, quite a lot of it would have needed to be released on the bus. If that had been the case, then why had only the bus driver and 1 passenger felt the effects? Also, weirdly, one of the paramedics started feeling the symptoms without having ever boarded the bus. Many pointed out that the new tests commissioned by the Vancouver Police Department did not include tests of other non-affected buses' air filters to act as a control group. It may have been that trace amounts of methyl chloride were common in other bus filters. This new round of tests did not address that question. Vancouver's chief medical officer, Dr. Blatherwick, reviewed the results of these tests and discovered that the amount of methyl chloride found was 27 parts per million. That is an inconsequential amount of methyl chloride and is not generally considered toxic. That amount of methyl chloride really should not make someone sick and is explainable by natural factors. 6 weeks later, a more robust study conducted by Dr. Rika Gustafsson confirmed that only people who heard the driver's story reported any symptoms of illness. And according to researchers Robert Bartholomew and Simon Wesley, quote, "Not a single medical complaint could be confirmed by any objective measure, including physical signs and laboratory tests." End quote. According to these experts, the best explanation for these bouts of nausea was a mass psychogenic illness. In 2004, we were still living in the shadow of 9/11. The so-called War on Terror was in full effect. Paranoia about terrorist attacks was acute, even in Canada. One cryptic remark from a dark-haired man with olive skin was enough to start a panic. Now, let me be clear. This doesn't necessarily mean that this bus driver was prejudiced against Middle Eastern people, at least not consciously. But he was living at a time when those prejudices were in the air. The media was filled with anxiety over the possibility of another terrorist attack by Muslim extremists. According to the experts, the driver's sickness was a physical manifestation of this shared societal anxiety. The weird part is that this can be contagious. This is the thing that most people find so hard to believe. This was the thing that the Vancouver police and the paramedics could not believe. And in the case of the police, were willing to embrace some shoddy science to avoid reckoning with. The stigma around mental illness, even a temporary mental illness, is enough for many to recoil from it as an explanation for a strange event. The passionate rejection of this explanation by the police and the paramedics is a perfect example of this. In those statements that I quoted from earlier, you can hear their offense at the suggestion that they were somehow psychologically weak. But the thing is, they weren't psychologically weak. They were psychologically human. In the end, no one was arrested, nor were any charges laid in connection with the toxic bus incident. But the explanation that this had been a strange expression of group psychology brought on by a society-wide anxiety remains controversial. Mass psychogenic illness is still poorly understood and is hard to study in any kind of controlled environment. There isn't much good science that can help us explain this phenomenon. But many experts believe that it is very real. What's intriguing to me is that in 2004, the bus driver and the Vancouver police immediately jumped to the same conclusion about what was afoot. This sudden nausea was surely the work of a Middle Eastern terrorist deploying a biological weapon. The great boogeyman of the age was clearly behind this. The bus driver even saw the boogeyman, and the boogeyman waved at him. Now imagine something like this happened in the 1600s. Someone is affected by a strange illness that comes out of nowhere. And then you remember that old woman in town that no one likes gave you a nasty look yesterday. You might start suspecting a witch. That brings us back to colonial Massachusetts. Can a mass psychogenic illness help explain the strange events that transpired in Salem in 1692? A number of unsettling behaviors started presenting in one little girl, then two, then four, then roughly a dozen. Was that first little girl physically reacting to all the anxiety that was swirling around her household, community, and colony? Then did those other young girls start to subconsciously mimic their affected friend? Were the parts of the brain that control our instinct to be pro-social hijacked by a shared delusion? While experts believe that this phenomenon is unconscious in nature, and therefore the girls would not have been doing this on purpose, what if a couple were? What if some of the girls genuinely could not control the fits, seizures, and other strange outbursts they were experiencing, but others could control them? How would you start picking that apart? You would have a crisis that was partly fueled by a truly uncontrollable mass psychological episode and partly fueled by people who believed that they could benefit from a crisis. But this kind of crisis is hard to contain, and very rarely does anyone ultimately profit. Can we untangle all of these threads? Let's give it a shot today on Our Fake History. Episode number 188, What Bewitched Salem, Part 2. Hello and welcome to Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story that it simply must be told. Before we get going this week, I just want to remind everyone that an ad-free version of this podcast is available through Patreon, along with a ton of other wonderful extra episodes. Start supporting at $5 or more every month, and you will get it all. I've also chosen my 5 favorite suggestions from the patrons, and now voting begins on what the next patrons-only extra episode will be on. So if you want to get in on the voting and you want to eventually get access to that extra show, then please head over to patreon.com/ourfakehistory and start supporting. I also want to mention that we now have a whole new raft of designs available on t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, stickers, and a buttload of other bric-a-brac at our TeePublic store. These designs are the listener favorites from the Season 8 episode art created by our amazing artist-in-residence, Frank Fiorentino. When you buy a shirt or a mug, you're not only supporting Our Fake History, you're also supporting Frank. So go check them out. Get your sweetie a t-shirt with Pythagoras on it. They'll love it. I know they will. Just go to ourfakehistory.com and follow the link to the store. Or go to tpublic.com/stores/our-fake-history. All right. This week, we are returning to colonial Massachusetts to continue our examination of the 1692 Salem Witch Crisis. This is part 2 in what is going to be a trilogy of episodes on Salem. So if you've not listened to part 1, then I strongly suggest that you go back and give that a listen now. In the first part, I spent some time considering why the Salem witch trials have gone down in history as the best remembered witch hunt, despite the fact that there were many other European witch panics that ultimately claimed hundreds more lives than the Salem episode. I also spent some time trying to place the Salem witch panic in the wider history of European witch hunting. Along the way, I tried to bust the myth that witch hunting was especially common during the so-called European Dark Age. Contrary to popular belief, witch hunting was fairly rare in the early medieval period, and Christian Europeans were generally more tolerant of folk magic considered to be helpful at that time. In contrast, the period that gets called the Renaissance, or the early modern period, is when witch hunting peaked in Europe and her colonies. As you heard, experts in historical witch hunts have pointed out that large-scale witchcraft panics usually occurred during moments of intense societal anxiety, brought on by famine, war, economic downturn, political turmoil, or a combination of those elements. I did my best to make the case that in the early 1690s, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was an especially anxious place. First, we introduced the New England Puritans, a group of English Calvinist Protestants who were convinced that the mainstream Church of England was still too Catholic. This group had made the Massachusetts Bay Colony in their image, enfranchising only adult males who were members of approved Puritan churches. But in the late 1680s, the colony had just gone through a period of political turmoil thanks to the autocratic governorship of Sir Edmund Andros. This saw the traditional Puritan leadership of the colony ousted from power and sidelined, only for them to claw their way back into power after the Boston Revolt of 1689. This political turmoil was paired with a series of bad harvests that had the colony importing food and an ongoing war on the frontier with the indigenous Wabanaki Confederacy and their French allies. Not to mention a pervasive feeling among the newly restored Puritan powers at be that the colony had fallen from God's favor and needed to be purged of sin. All this made Massachusetts particularly ripe for a witchcraft panic in 1692. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking, Sebastian, that last episode was pretty thick on context. There couldn't possibly be anything else I need to know before we get into the details of this thing. And I hear you, and I promise to keep this train on the tracks, but we haven't had a chance to talk about the community of Salem Village itself, and understanding the unique dynamic of that colonial settlement in 1692 is essential to unpacking this whole strange event. If anxiety and discord are the essential precursors for a witch panic, then it's absolutely no surprise that Salem is where America's best remembered witch hunt touched off. The settlement had originally been established in 1626, and in 1629 was rechristened Salem, an anglicization of the Hebrew word shalom. It very briefly served as the capital of the Massachusetts Bay Colony until 1630, when a new governor, displeased with the location of the town, founded a new capital in Boston, which he believed had a better natural harbor. For the next few decades, Salem would be a political and commercial rival to Boston, a city that would eventually grow into one of America's foremost urban centers. As the population of Massachusetts swelled with the arrival of new, mostly Puritan immigrants, in the mid-1670s, the settlement of Salem split into two distinct entities. The original seaside port town became known as Salem Town, and a few kilometers inland, a growing farm community became known as Salem Village. The events that touched off the witch hunt all took place in Salem Village. Even before the witch hunt, Salem Village had a reputation for being fractious and difficult. For the community of Salem Village to become completely independent of Salem Town in the eyes of the colonial authorities, it needed to be able to sustain its own minister and church. But Salem Village had a very difficult time doing this. Between 1672 and 1689, the village burned through 3 different Puritan ministers before hiring the Reverend Samuel Parris, whose daughter, Betty Parris, was the first of the allegedly bewitched girls. 4 ministers over 17 years was considered a lot, as these positions were often held for life. The issue was that the community had a hard time paying their ministers. Historian David Goss has gone so far as to describe the congregation in Salem Village as, quote, irritable and stingy, end quote. When the Reverend Samuel Parris took over the post in 1689, he was soon faced with many of the same issues that had convinced his predecessors to leave the village. In the months leading up to the witchcraft crisis, Reverend Parris found himself in a bitter dispute with members of the community who did not want to pay him. The factionalism tearing at Salem Village in the years leading up to 1692 has been best illuminated by the groundbreaking work of social historians Stephen Niesenbaum and Paul Boyer. Their book, Salem Possessed, used a painstaking analysis of primary sources from Salem to make a very strong case that the witch trials were just one particularly dramatic expression of Salem Village's long-simmering factional conflict. Now, I'm going to be returning to Niesenbaum and Boyer's analysis throughout this series, but for now, here's what you need to understand about Salem's factions. First, there was a less wealthy group of farmers that wanted Salem Village to be more independent from Salem Town. This group had once been quite influential, but now their influence was fading. They tended to support the local minister and were aligned with Samuel Parris at the time of the witch hunt. The other group in Salem tended to be wealthier and were less interested in the independence of Salem Village, as their fortunes were tied to the maritime commerce of Salem Town. By extension, they were less interested in sustaining a church in Salem Village and paying a minister there. This group's influence was growing. As Niesenbaum and Boyer have demonstrated, conflict between these two groups is well documented in the legal records and petitions to colonial authorities in the years leading up to 1692. Interestingly, once the witch trials broke out, many of the accusations fell along the lines of these factions. The accusers were mostly the poor village-focused group aligned with Reverend Parris. The accused were often from the wealthier Salem Town-oriented faction. In their book, Niesenbaum and Boyer explained that, quote, "All our reading about the events of 1692 had prepared us to view the witch hunters as a dominant and ruthless group that had taken the offensive against a set of weak, powerless outcasts. What we actually found, as the trials fell into a longer historical perspective, was something quite different. The witch hunters may have been on the offensive in 1692, but it was a fleeting offensive, a counter-offensive, really, in the midst of a general, sustained retreat." End quote. In other words, the faction in Salem that had been declining economically may have seized on the witch crisis to turn the tables on their wealthy neighbors and claw back land and economic opportunity that they felt they were owed. But of course, this is just another layer to an already dense cake. What is less clear is if this crisis was created as part of the Salem factional Cold War, or if the Parris faction simply seized on the crisis to settle some scores. There's an old saying about cynical politics that you should never let a good crisis go to waste. Is that what some were attempting to do in Salem, only to see the situation careen out of their control? To try and answer these questions, I think it's time to start moving chronologically through the events of 1692. As we move through the unfolding witch crisis, I'll do my best to bring in some explanations that might help us understand the more confounding moments in the whole affair. Of course, I'll also do my best to bust any and all historical myths that pop up along the way. Now, as one final caveat, I'm going to warn you. The Salem Witch Trials features a cast of hundreds. So it's very easy to get overwhelmed with names when trying to make sense of this story, especially if you're new to it. So I'm going to try and introduce people only as needed, so we hopefully don't drown in names. Now, I've already gotten messages from people who are descended from folks who were involved in the Salem Witch Trials. First, that's so cool. Thanks for reaching out. But for all those listening, waiting to hear the name of your ancestor, I can't promise that it's going to be mentioned. There's a lot to juggle here, so please don't expect an attendance list of everyone touched by the witch trials. All right, let's head back to the winter of 1691-1692 and start examining exactly how this crisis touched off. In December of 1691, Elizabeth Betty Paris, the 9-year-old daughter of the Reverend Samuel Paris, started acting very strangely. As I detailed in part 1 of this series, seemingly out of nowhere, the girl started having episodes where she would become unresponsive and stare off into the distance. She would have seizure-like fits and would bark like a dog or start coughing like she was being choked. She also started to complain that she was being pinched or poked by invisible hands. Now, the exact timeline on this is a little unclear, but not long after Betty first started exhibiting this strange behavior, may have been a few days, may have been a few weeks, her cousin, who lived with Betty, Abigail Williams, also started to be afflicted by the same condition. By the end of February, nearly 2 months after the onset of Betty's odd symptoms, 2 other girls, Anne Putnam Jr. and Elizabeth Hubbard, also started exhibiting the same strange behavior and started complaining of being pinched and choked by invisible hands. So, one of the key questions here is what brought on these symptoms in the first place? Well, that is a very difficult question to answer, but we can start by busting some long-held myths about this event. First, we need to talk about Tituba, the first person accused of witchcraft in Salem, and arguably the most misunderstood figure in this entire event. Tituba, who in some documents is named as Tituba Indian, was a slave who was owned by the Reverend Paris. You see, before Samuel Paris became the minister of Salem Village, he had spent a number of years in Barbados, where he had tried his hand at being a merchant. It was while he was in Barbados that he purchased Tituba from another English settler on the island to work as a household servant. He also purchased a male servant, a man named John, or John Indian, who by 1692 was identified as Tituba's husband. When Reverend Paris moved his whole family back to Massachusetts, he brought his 2 slaves with him. There's a tradition out there that Tituba sparked the whole witchcraft scare because she was practicing voodoo or some other type of folk magic in the house and sharing these rituals with the young girls in her charge. It sometimes gets reported that Tituba had been leading the girls from the community in dances in the woods. This is the version of the Tituba story that was incorporated into Arthur Miller's famous play, The Crucible. Act 1 of The Crucible opens with the Reverend Samuel Paris having just discovered his daughter, niece, and a group of other local girls dancing naked in the woods, while Tituba led some sort of pagan ritual. In the play, the audience later learns that Tituba had indeed been using some form of magic that she learned in Barbados, but it had all been done at the urging of the duplicitous Abigail Williams. In Arthur Miller's imagination, the girls were all faking their symptoms of bewitchment at the insistence of Abigail. In the play, Abigail had wanted Tituba to help her curse a local woman named Elizabeth Proctor, the wife of her former lover, John Proctor. The whole witch trial spins out of control as Abigail and her friends start accusing local women of witchcraft to hide their own dabbling in black magic. Now, it's important to know that Arthur Miller took all sorts of license as an artist when he wrote this play. All of these characters were based on real people who lived in Salem during the witch trials, but Miller drastically changed many of their biographies to better fit the story he wanted to tell. His play explains the strange behavior of the girls as mostly cynical play acting meant to cover for bad behavior that would have had them all punished. The story of the affair between John Proctor and Abigail Williams is a total invention. In the play, Miller aged up Abigail to 17 years old and concocted a backstory where she'd worked as a maid for the Proctors before being fired by Elizabeth Proctor, who became suspicious about her relationship with her husband John. In reality, Abigail Williams was only 12 when the witch trials began, and there's no historical evidence that she had any contact with John Proctor, a man who would eventually be accused of witchcraft, before they met in court in 1692. There was no affair between the two. Similarly, the idea that Abigail insisted that Tituba perform a magical ritual was an invention by Arthur Miller. Miller's depiction of Tituba came out of a thoroughly wrong late 19th century tradition that assumed that Tituba was a black Barbadian woman who was either descended from West African slaves or may have been born in West Africa herself. This tradition also assumed that Tituba was either a voodoo priestess or someone who was familiar with voodoo or other forms of folk magic practiced in Caribbean slave communities. But all of this is completely wrong. The most thorough examination of the real Tituba has to be historian Elaine Breslau's 1996 study titled Tituba, the Reluctant Witch of Salem. For that book, Breslau undertook some impressive original research that did much to dispel many of the myths and misconceptions about Tituba. She also made a strong case for a new understanding of exactly how Tituba fit into the witchcraft crisis of 1692. First, Breslau very clearly demonstrates that Tituba was not a black woman descended from West African people. She was an indigenous woman, descended from the Arawak-speaking people of the Caribbean. Now, determining her exact tribal association is almost impossible, as indigenous people in the Caribbean were constantly misidentified in this period. You might remember from the Columbus episodes, more peaceful groups of indigenous Caribbeans were sometimes called Taino, whereas aggressive groups were labeled Caribs. But these designations could change if a colonial power became interested in a piece of territory. All of this muddies the water when trying to determine the tribal origins of specific indigenous people from the islands, especially those who had been forced into slavery. With that said, Breslau has demonstrated that all the relevant records from this era clearly identify Tituba as an indigenous person. The ersatz surname given to her by her enslavers was Indian, after all. She was Tituba Indian. Even in Massachusetts, no one seems to have been confused about her ethnicity. It was only in the 19th century when writers started to assume that she was West African. Next, there's no evidence that Tituba practiced voodoo or any form of indigenous Caribbean religion or magic. There's sometimes an assumption that because she was a Caribbean slave, she had to have been into something a little witchy. But Elaine Breslau has shown that that is simply not the case. Before the events of 1692, there's no evidence that Tituba dabbled in any type of magic, indigenous or otherwise. Now, in Arthur Miller's play, it's implied that while Tituba may have been engaging in exotic rituals, they were only satanic from a Puritan perspective. In other words, Tituba was persecuted because of a Puritan fear of religious traditions they did not understand. But Breslau goes a step further and argues that Tituba hadn't been doing anything that could have been perceived as witchcraft, even by the intolerant Puritans. That was until late February 1692, and we'll come back to that. You see, the stories about the girls engaging in naughty dances in the woods and dabbling in foreign traditions that they did not fully understand are a huge exaggeration of what's actually in the sources. Instead, it seems that in the months that led up to Betty Paris's first signs of affliction, she and a few other local girls had been playing a fortune-telling game that involved an egg white and a glass of water. One of the contemporary sources adorably calls these little fortune-telling games, quote, little sorceries. This game worked by putting an egg white in a glass of warm water and then interpreting the shapes made by the egg as it denatured. The game was supposed to give you details about who you were going to marry. Some historians believe that the girls had been fooling around with these kinds of games for months, knowing that they were forbidden by their Puritan parents, but also not thinking that they were all that serious. And to be clear, they weren't all that serious. If the girls had been discovered playing these games, they probably would have been punished for naughty behavior, but they wouldn't have been accused of witchcraft. The issue seems to have arisen when during one of these fortune-telling sessions, one of the girls saw something in an egg white that she thought looked like a coffin, an ominous portent of death. This, potentially, could have been the inciting incident for Betty Paris's strange behavior. The spooky omen may have genuinely frightened the little girl, who also may have felt guilty for engaging in one of the little sorceries that she knew were forbidden. She also may have been carrying a base level of anxiety shared by everyone in her community, brought on by all those factors we discussed at length in the first episode in this series. It seems like a reasonable guess that all this stress and anxiety was pushed past a breaking point after the girl gave herself a real scare. This may have triggered the psychological episode where she appeared to be bewitched. The fact that Betty's cousin Abigail Williams and her two neighbors, girls who had also been part of the fortune-telling games, started to mirror Betty's behavior can potentially be explained as an example of mass psychogenic illness. Not all that different from Vancouver's toxic bus event. After seeing Betty's odd behavior, they were psychologically triggered and unconsciously started to exhibit the same psychosomatic illness. Now, I want to remind everyone that this is just a guess. But it's a guess that I find compelling, so I'm laying it out for you. Now, it's sometimes reported that Tituba was involved in these fortune-telling sessions, that she had been entertaining the girls with what she would have perceived as harmless bits of folk magic. But historian Elaine Breslau has pointed out that all the earliest descriptions of these fortune-telling games do not mention Tituba at all. She also points out that the egg and glass fortune-telling technique is an English tradition. It has nothing to do with indigenous Caribbean spirituality or voodoo, for that matter. all of the early descriptions of the girl's little sorceries do not involve Tituba. So, how does Tituba get roped into all of this? Well, by late February 1692, the whole Salem village community had become aware of Betty and Abigail's strange affliction. The Reverend Samuel Parris had been organizing group prayers to try and heal the girls through spiritual means. This went on for over a month, with the girls showing no sign of improvement. So, one of the Parris' neighbors, a woman named Mary Sibley, decided that she would help. She approached Tituba and her husband John and explained how they might help the girls by performing a bit of counter magic. Sibley explained to Tituba how to bake something called a witch cake. Tituba needed to get some of the girls' urine and then bake it into a rye flour cake that was then rolled in ashes. Then she needed to feed the cake to a dog. If the dog started exhibiting the same symptoms as the afflicted girls, then witchcraft would be proven. Further, the dog was then supposed to lead you directly to the witch who had conjured the dark magic. Now again, this is a form of magic from the so-called cunning folk of England. This was not a form of Caribbean indigenous magic. Tituba was taught how to do this by one of her English Puritan neighbors. So, in late February, Tituba took Mary Sibley's advice, baked the cake, and fed it to a dog. Sadly, the witch cake did not work. And even worse, the Reverend Samuel Parris found out about this almost immediately. Sources tell us that the Reverend Parris beat Tituba until she confessed to having made the cake. But she was adamant, at least at first, that that was all she'd done. But this was a turning point, because now there was proof that some form of magic was being practiced in the Reverend's home. Now, once again, the timeline gets muddy here, but by February 25th, it seems like many others in the community had found out about the witch cake. This is significant because it was only then that the two neighbor girls, Elizabeth Hubbard and Ann Putnam Jr., became afflicted by the same condition tormenting Betty and Abigail. It was in the direct aftermath of the witch cake incident that the first round of accusations took place. After having secured a confession from Tituba, the Reverend Parris then started to question the girls more pointedly about who in the community was doing this to them. The girls were unsure at first, but eventually they gave up three names: Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. It's been suggested by historian David Goss, whose book on Salem is essentially a compilation of other scholarship on the trials, that these names may have been suggested to the girls by the Reverend Parris. He almost certainly mentioned Tituba in his questioning of his daughter, but the records only hint at this, so that remains controversial. Soon, the other two girls, Elizabeth Hubbard and Ann Putnam, were also accusing Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne of being their tormentors. A few days later, on February 29th, the male guardians of these young women appeared before the magistrates of Salem and made an official complaint against the three accused witches. The magistrates issued a warrant and set about arresting all of the women involved. On March 1st, the first preliminary hearing into what would become the Salem Witch Trials got underway in the Salem Meeting House, after being moved from Ingersoll's Tavern to accommodate the large crowd of onlookers. Now, there is a version of this event where things may have ended here. These 3 women would have been tried, likely found guilty, executed, and the community would have moved on. That's how most witch hunts worked. But that's not how things played out in Salem. The testimony given on the first day would suggest that these 3 women were just the tip of the iceberg. Tituba would end up making a confession so devastating in its implications that soon the entire colony would be swept up in a full-scale witch panic. So, let's take a quick break. And when we return, we'll explore exactly how this unfolded. The arrest of Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne in 1692 could be understood as the authorities rounding up the usual witchy suspects. In many ways, these 3 women perfectly fit the profile for a typical 17th century New England witchcraft suspect. Through a wide-ranging study of witchcraft cases in both America and Europe, historian John Demos has been able to construct a helpful picture of who was typically accused of witchcraft at this time and why they often got accused. First, accused witches were overwhelmingly women. Demos has shown that during the witch craze centuries of the 1500s and the 1600s, approximately 80% of people tried for witchcraft in Europe and America were women. Now, this means that a sizable minority, 20%, were men. There's a misconception that witch hunts only targeted women. Turns out witch hunts only mostly targeted women. To understand why, one needs to look no further than the infamous 15th century witch hunting manual known as the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of the Witches. Early on in that book, the authors posed the question, quote, "Why is it that women are chiefly addicted to evil superstition?" End quote. They then go on to answer this question by arguing that in the book of Genesis, quote, "there was a defect in the formation of the first woman, since she was formed from a bent rib." End quote. Further, they argue that women are more impressionable, more credulous, and, quote, "feebler in mind and body," end quote. The negative stereotypes don't stop there. The authors also insist that women are, quote, "liars by nature," end quote, being possessed of a, quote, "slippery tongue," end quote. Finally, they argue that a woman is, quote, "more carnal than a man, as is clear from her many carnal abominations," end quote. This insatiable female lust, of course, makes her more likely to be seduced by the devil. So, these are quite literally the oldest stereotypes in the book, like Old Testament old. It was thought that women were more likely to be witches because, like Eve in the Garden of Eden, they were naturally sinful, naturally deceitful, and unable to resist the sexually charged advances of Satan. John Demos also points out that the people who were usually accused in small-scale witch hunts tended to be the least powerful people in society. Poorer women were more likely to be accused than rich women. Widows or older unmarried women with few male relatives were also more likely to be accused. Now, you would think that the other piece of the puzzle would be a familiarity with folk magic, or the secretive practice of an ancient pagan fertility rite. Women who worked as healers, midwives, or cunning folk most surely had to have been targeted. And while that was sometimes true, the practice of folk magic wasn't often the thing that got someone identified as a witch. I know, I was surprised by that. The thing that usually got a person accused of witchcraft was simply being unpleasant. If you were a poor woman with few male protectors, and you were known for having a sharp tongue, being publicly grumpy, or you had a history of getting into disputes with your neighbors, then you were exactly the kind of person who would be accused of witchcraft. If you were pleasant, well-connected, and you also happened to dabble in magic, then you were less likely to be accused than one of these poor women. John Demos's study demonstrates that the vast majority of people accused of witchcraft generally, but especially in 17th century New England, were women who had some form of earlier dispute with their accusers. Demos explains that the process that he observed playing out again and again in the sources is that first, a woman has a dispute with a neighbor. Whatever the outcome of that dispute, the neighbor senses that this woman is angry. Maybe she even swears at him. This puts that woman on the map as a potential witch. Then, sometime down the road, something bad happens to the neighbor. A family member gets sick, a cow dies, a crop fails. The neighbor then blames the event on that angry woman he had a dispute with. And boom, she's a witch. The small-scale witch hunt is a clear example of a community taking their anxieties out on a scapegoat. But usually, once the goat, or witch, is killed, the process ends. You can see the pattern identified by Demos operating in the early stages of the Salem witch trials. You may have already clocked the somewhat curious fact that Mary Sibley, the woman who instructed Tituba to bake a witch cake, was not accused of witchcraft herself. The Reverend Paris knew what she did, and by mid-March 1692, Sibley would publicly confess to her role in the witch cake incident. But even though she was involved in some folk magic, she was never accused of being one of the witches in Salem. Why? Well, historian Elaine Breslaw has pointed out that Mary Sibley and her husband Spencer were vocal supporters of the Reverend Paris in Salem Village's factional disputes. Mary Sibley was on Team Paris, which was a good team to be on when the allegations of witchcraft started flying around. At least at the start of this crisis, having literally participated in magic was less damning than fitting the mold of a typical New England witch. But the other important insight provided by historian John Demos is that in cases where a witch hunt evolves into a full-on witch panic, the typical profile of a witch completely gets thrown out the window. One of the things that makes these panics so remarkable is that the kinds of people who are not usually accused of witchcraft all of a sudden find themselves accused. The longer a witch crisis persists, the more likely you are to see rich people, upper-class people, men, and members of the clergy accused. There's something about the group psychology of a panic that obliterates the typical stereotype of a witch. In other words, there's a typical witch until there isn't. The three women who were interrogated in the pre-trial hearings of March 1st, 1692, fit everyone's conception of what a witch should be. Sarah Good was a textbook example of the kind of woman who usually got accused of witchcraft in New England. Sarah had been from a well-to-do family, but through a series of unfortunate events, she had been left destitute and often had to beg for charity from her neighbors in Salem. Over time, she got a reputation for being difficult. One set of neighbors, who had given her a place to live for a period of time, eventually kicked her out for having, quote, so turbulent a spirit, spiteful, and so maliciously bent, end quote. She also got a reputation for getting angry with people who weren't receptive to her pleas for charity. She was even known to get pissy with people who did give her charity. There was a rumor that the Reverend Paris himself had once given Sarah Good charity, and even then she had indignantly walked off muttering. It didn't help Sarah's reputation that she was rarely seen attending church. She was exactly the kind of person who was usually targeted during a witch hunt. So, sure enough, during the initial hearings, Sarah Good found herself not only accused by the afflicted children, but also by a long list of other residents of Salem Village who had befallen some misfortune and were sure that Sarah Good was behind it. Sarah's case was not helped at all by her husband, William Good, whose testimony would almost be funny if the consequences had not been so deadly serious. When he took the stand, he told Salem's magistrates that his wife was, quote, either a witch or would soon become one, end quote. He also threw in the often quoted observation that she was, quote, an enemy to all good, end quote, which not enough people point out is a pun. His last name was Good, and his wife was an enemy of all good. Get it? Dude was up there dunking on his wife like this was a bad 90s sitcom. So, very early on in this process, everyone became convinced that Sarah Good was a witch, even though there was no material evidence that she had ever dabbled in any type of magic or had any reason to torment the girls. For her part, Sarah Good insisted that she was innocent and proposed that the two other accused women, Sarah Osborne and Tituba, were actually behind the bewitching of the four afflicted girls. Sarah Osborne was a less typical witch than Sarah Good, but she was a controversial figure in Salem. Her first husband had been a brother-in-law to the Putnam family of Salem Village. The Putnams were an influential but declining family neck-deep in the local factional disputes. They were one of the key families who supported the Reverend Paris, and they openly worried about their local clout slipping away. Interestingly, Thomas Putnam's daughter, Anne Putnam Jr., was one of the first girls outside of the Paris household to start acting bewitched. At the time that Sarah Osborne was accused by Thomas Putnam of bewitching his daughter, she was embroiled in a nasty legal dispute with the Putnam family over the inheritance of her late husband's estate. She was trying to keep ownership of the farm for herself, as opposed to passing it directly to her sons, as was the custom. The Putnams were involved in the legal dispute on behalf of the sons, who were considered Putnam allies in the fractious environment of Salem. Sarah Osborne was also considered scandalous because she had remarried a man from Ireland who had been an indentured servant before he bought his freedom. Her neighbors believed that she had married below her station, and the only reason one would do that was because they were impiously lustful. She was a woman who bucked convention, was asserting her right to property, and had made some influential enemies. Again, there was no evidence that she was interested in any type of magic, but she was an assertive woman who had lost her male protectors. When Osborne took the stand, she adamantly denied any wrongdoing and insisted that she was a, quote, gospel woman. Unlike Sarah Good, she refrained from throwing the other accused women under the bus. Instead, she claimed that she too was being tormented by the devil, just like the afflicted girls. She was a victim just as they were, as evidenced by her declining health. Finally, there was Tituba. And in many ways, Tituba represented all sorts of Puritan fears. She came from the lowest possible rung of New England's society. She was a female slave. She was also an indigenous woman. As I introduced in the last episode, paranoia about attacks from the indigenous Wabanaki Confederacy was at an all-time high. Most Puritans would not have made much of a distinction between Tituba, whose roots were in Barbados, and the people they were fighting in King William's War. There was a persistent belief in New England that native people from across the Americas were in league with the devil. They were often referred to as Satan's minions in many contemporary texts. Just by being indigenous, Tituba fit the mold of a witch in New England. When Tituba took the stand, she did not deny the charges laid against her. Instead, she made a confession that was so detailed, so full of harrowing descriptions, and so disturbing in its implications, that it became clear to all listening that Salem had been infiltrated by a satanic conspiracy more vast than any of them had previously imagined. Over the course of March 1st and March 2nd, at the prompting of her questioners, Tituba would tell the tale of a terrifying demonic plot. It took 2 sessions of the hearing to tease out all the details, but in essence, Tituba told the court that she was, in fact, a witch. She had been converted into witchery by a demonic man who first visited her at night a few months earlier. She was then spirited away by a devilish power to a witches' sabbath that was held in Boston. At this meeting was the devil himself, as well as 5 other people. 2 of those people were Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, but the others Tituba didn't recognize. 2 were women, and 1 was a tall man. The group threatened to kill Tituba if she did not help them torment the 4 afflicted girls. So she helped, a choice she told the court that she now regretted. She also made the fateful choice to sign the devil's book and make a pact with Satan. She then colored in this description of the witch's Sabbath with all sorts of weird details. The man present had the ability to change shape, and before her eyes he transformed into a dog, then a pig, and then back into a man. This coven of witches was also surrounded by other strange creatures: demonic yellow birds, rats, a wolf, a black cat, 4 seemingly possessed women, and a strange 3-foot-tall, hairy imp. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, where did all of this come from? Well, in the past, historians wrote off Tituba's testimony as the ramblings of a terrified slave. But historian Elaine Breslaw has pushed back on that prejudiced interpretation. Breslaw has argued that Tituba was doing everything she could to save herself from execution. It was widely known that in Puritan New England, a penitent confession could often earn an accused person mercy. Tituba had already discovered after being beaten by Samuel Parris that people did not believe her when she said she'd done nothing more than follow Mary Sibley's advice to bake a witch cake. She may have concluded that the only way out was through, and that meant a detailed confession paired with a sincere repentance. From there, Breslaw argues that Tituba improvised a story that she thought her Puritan inquisitors wanted to hear. Breslaw points out that, quote, as is typical of witchcraft interrogations in all cultures, Tituba's questioners provided her with clues as to what her answers should be, end quote. Her testimony was essentially a witch-themed game of Mad Libs suggested by her questioners. Breslaw has also guessed that Tituba may not have fully appreciated how this confession would expand the scope of what would become the Salem witch trials. She writes, quote, Tituba probably thought that she had only to demonstrate true repentance for her past behavior to end her trial, end quote. But Tituba had instead opened a can of worms that could not so easily be closed. Her trial was far from over. In fact, she had just made herself into an indispensable witness for a huge proceeding that would draw in hundreds of people. Tituba's story about a coven of witches based in Boston that involved a number of people still yet to be identified meant that there were more witches to find. And those witches weren't just in Salem. They were all over Massachusetts. If the Salem witchcraft panic was like a wildfire, then the local factionalism, regional political turmoil, and global climate crisis is what made the ground dry and ready to combust. The strange behavior of the afflicted girls provided a spark that lit the first flame. Tituba's testimony was the accelerant that very quickly turned that flame into an uncontrollable inferno. Before Tituba could even finish her testimony on the first day, the descriptions of the demonic rituals became too much for the afflicted girls. As Tituba was describing a demonic wolf, one of the girls, Elizabeth Hubbard, suddenly sprang out of her seat. When her symptoms first presented just a few days earlier, Elizabeth had told the adults in her life that one of the things that was tormenting her was a horrible spectral wolf. Now, here was Tituba describing just such a wolf. She was overcome and fell into what records describe as a, quote, extreme fit, end quote. The other girls very quickly followed suit, convulsing and screaming. It was so intense that the hearing had to be brought to an end for the day. But this intense response from the girls would become increasingly common as these pre-trial hearings gave way to the official proceedings of the Salem witch trials. The afflicted children were not simply there to be witnesses. Their behavior in court became evidence. Okay, that's all for this week. Join us again in 2 weeks' time when we will wrap up our series on the Salem witch trials. Before we go this week, I just want to remind everyone that on November 4th, I'm going to be speaking at the Intelligent Speech Conference. So if you want tickets to Intelligent Speech, go to intelligentspeechonline.com and get your tickets now. Also use promo code FAKE to get a discount. As always, before we go, I need to give a shout out to some very special people. Big ups to Jason P., to Hannah Hussein, to D. Long, to Andrew Brown, to Paul Phillips, to John Corso, to Daniela Smith Fernandez, to Lauren Kane, to Jake, to Anthony Vila. Apologies to this next supporter because I know I'm going to butcher this name, but thanks to Eoin, or is it Eoin? Eoin Rooney? Anyway, thank you so much for your support. Sorry about that. Big ups to Chase Burrell, to Brock Lang, to Nico Ballas, to Shannon Blackmore, to Just Another Tony, and to Marcus Dayak. All of these folks have decided to pledge at $5 or more every month on Patreon, so you know what that means. They are beautiful human beings. Thank you, thank you, thank you for your support of this podcast. It means a lot. And patrons, let me remind you that voting is now open for the next extra episode. So go to the Patreon page, patreon.com/OurFakeHistory, and let your voice be known in our poll. If you want to get in touch with me, then please send me an email at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. Find me on Facebook at facebook.com/ourfakehistory. Find me on Twitter at ourfakehistory. Find me on Instagram as ourfakehistory. Find me on TikTok at ourfakehistory. And while you're doing all that, why not head over to YouTube, look for Our Fake History there, and like and subscribe to the YouTube channel to get the exclusive digital shorts that I'm creating over there. The theme music for the show comes to us from Dirty Church. You can check out Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. And all the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major, and remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.
I know some of you out there are like, I don't know if I want to listen to a history podcast, but here's the thing. Are you interested in celebrity gossip in general? What about literally gossip of friends of friends? Like, can you believe that she hooked up with that guy? That's literally what we're doing on Vulgar History. It's a feminist women's history comedy podcast hosted by me, Anne Foster. Hear all the latest scandals from olden times on Vulgar History. New episodes every Wednesday wherever you get your podcasts.
I earned my degree online at Arizona State University. I chose to get my degree at ASU because I knew that I'd get a quality education, they were recognized for excellence, and that I would be prepared for the workforce upon graduating. To be associated with ASU, both as a student and alum, it makes me extremely proud, and having experienced the program, I know now that I'm set up for success. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu.